Good morning, everyone. I would like to thank you all for attending this panel entitled Gender Issues and Protection of Civilians in Peace Operations. We have 4 panelists that are going to talk about this particular subject that is extremely important in the context of peacekeeping operations. So we have first Marcia Henry from London School of Economics. She's Associate Professor and Deputy Director of the Center for Women, Peace and Security at the London School of Economics. Henry's research interests focus on gender and development, gender and militarization. Over the past 12 years, her research interests have been concentrated on documenting the social experiences of living and working in peacekeeping missions. Her recent research focuses on peacekeepers from the Global South. So, Marcia, you have 15 minutes. And then we're going to proceed for the following presentations. Thank you very much, Marcia.
Okay, so I'm going to talk quite practically. I'm going to talk quite practically about 2 general gender issues. They've been labeled gender issues. But I guess I would advise you, if you're students and people interested in researching gender issues, that these really shouldn't be the gender issues that we're discussing. So I'm kind of asking for a kind of moratorium on talking about these issues precisely, I hope, because of what I outline as some of the problems. So the first topic that you will be very familiar with and has been of particular concern in the Brazilian context is the issue of female peacekeepers. So if you don't know already, there has been a lot of rhetoric from the UN, a lot of public speak about increasing the number of female peacekeepers. And there have been a couple of publications very recently in the last 2 years trying to document some of the issues raised by the introduction of female peacekeepers into peacekeeping spaces. One is Leslie Pruitt's Blue Helmets, which I think is a really interesting account following the experiences of militarized police women peacekeepers from India in Liberia. And the other is a book by Sabrina Karim and Kyle Beardsley, which is called Equal Opportunity Peacekeeping, a huge, massive overview of all the different issues raised by, who's contributing female personnel to what is it that actually female personnel, when deployed in peacekeeping missions, what are the kinds of challenges they face. Oh, suddenly. Okay, so I would recommend, even though I've said really stop doing stuff on this topic, I would recommend those 2 books to start. I mean, one of the interesting things is just to think about very simply, what's the composition of female peacekeepers? I mean, there's still a very small number of women in peacekeeping missions, as I was talking about yesterday. And you can imagine there's a very small number in the military. It's still fairly insignificant in statistical terms. In the police, it's been increasing. So police peacekeepers has increased over the years from anywhere between 10 and 20% of the contributions. So, and then of course, although we don't traditionally call civilian staff peacekeepers, there is a much better representation of women within the civilian sector. So some of the issues that I think have come up in looking at the rhetoric of the UN has been about, the sort of what female peacekeepers bring to peacekeeping missions, and this debate has been ongoing within the context of integration of female and other minority groups into security sector more generally. But what I found in some of the research that I've done is that in practice, there is, some of these ongoing issues around discrimination or marginalization of female personnel within national militaries persist in a very different way in the peacekeeping context. So a good example of this is the sort of very sex-segregated experiences of Indian police women in Liberia. So you have what is called by the UN and by the Indian military police themselves, all-female squad. You have sort of like 120 women that are sent from a pool of about 4,000 women, actually. So you just imagine that the Indian Special Police Forces has this resource pool of around 4,000, which is actually pretty significant for the UN, but not significant in size in comparison to the Indian military or the Indian police forces more generally. So you have this 120 women sent to mission. They live in very sex-segregated contexts. There's a general no fraternization rule for most militaries anyway, but then this is kind of like superimposed on this very sex-segregated context. And there's also, of course, traditional military ethos engendered throughout these squads. So, in fact, what you have is no real substantial challenge to the sort of structural inequalities, structural gender inequalities. You have kind of like almost a transplanting of a fairly conventional patriarchal or gender division of labor within these sort of exported military and peacekeeping contexts. And of course, just another example, the kinds of duties that these Indian female peacekeepers have been engaged in. I mean, they are not trained to attend to women who have experienced sexual violence, for example, although this is very much the kind of public expectation that, by sending women into missions, that there will suddenly be a kind of, not only a role model for local women and girls, but that there will be this kind of response, or that there will be a reduction in sexual exploitation and abuse, which I'll talk about in a moment. So, but in fact, actually, the level of engagement of public interaction with the local population is highly limited because of expectations because of force protection issues. So people are very anxious about their peacekeepers, national militaries, and also because they're not trained to be involved in public engagement. Actually, the Indian women police officers are trained they have advanced weapons training. They're trained for crowd dispersal and riot. They're essentially riot police. And then they've done some close protection work with the former president of Liberia, Ellen Johnson Sirleaf, in early days. So, in fact, they're not engaged in the type of engagement that one might expect. So just, and I think, as I said, as I was saying yesterday, there's a disproportionate number of these same-sex squads coming from Global South militaries, whereas you get in deployments from, say, Sweden or Canada or Norway, you'll get a number of sort of senior female officers, very often from the police, but they will not be deployed in this critical mass way. So there'll be individual officers, or perhaps even military observers. So you get very different types of groupings, and of course they have very different effects. Of course, some of the attempts by researchers have been to measure what the reduction in sexual exploitation and abuse has been by introducing female peacekeepers, but overall, I would say the project of introducing female peacekeepers to the entire space has been quite minuscule. So it's very difficult, I think, to measure that reduction in any meaningful way. So just two last things about female peacekeepers, and again, we can talk about this in the discussion, but I think the UN in particular has imagined a kind of global sisterhood that would be enacted by deploying female peacekeepers without any sort of real consideration of logistical challenges, of cultural, subcultural military expectations and ethos. I mean, if you ask virtually any female peacekeeper, military or police, about gender issues, they will almost unanimously tell you, like, I don't really want to talk about gender issues, precisely because, research has shown that for the most part, for women to be integrated into conventional military context, they need to actually minimize attention to gender and model themselves on generally male standards and norms or masculine expectations. So, in fact, talking to female peacekeepers is actually, contributing to their somewhat heightened visibility, which they don't always want. So, the other issue, and I think it relates to this interest in female peacekeepers, is really around sexual exploitation and abuse. So, what I want to say about sexual exploitation and abuse is maybe just to show you some of the very recent ways in which the UN is attempting to, I guess, address issues of exploitation and abuse from a number of different angles. So this is pretty recent. It's August 2017. If you do want to have some fun, look through this military aid memoir. I don't know if anyone's ever looked through it, but it's essentially, so the full paper form of it is a little bit longer, but every peacekeeper is given this. Sorry, if you just go through. Yeah, that's probably good. But there's a number of sort of poster forms that have been reduced to business card size. So this is one that peacekeepers are asked to carry around just to remind them not to rape and exploit local people in case they forget while they're out. So it's a little bit. So they have this carrying card that they, it's about reminding people of the rules and the code of conduct, and we can talk about whether that's a bit of a. I mean, it's not really that hard to critique that, but still, nevertheless. And then it's very interesting. On one of the cards, they have pictures really to sort of show what exploitation looks like, and then what prosecution looks like, and then what imprisonment looks like. It's just so you're reminded when you look at that card every day, as you do when you're in mission, about the consequences. So it's sort of no excuse, zero tolerance, and then these images. And of course, the images are very telling because they depict a peacekeeper. Let's see if we can just flip through to find that. Keep going, sorry. I should have brought up that image. Yeah, that one. That's it. So you can't see very well, sorry, the image, but the image of the peacekeeper, you can kind of tell where this peacekeeping mission might be located. You can't quite tell the sort of ethnic or racial background of the peacekeeper. You can make assumptions from that bad sketch. And then obviously the type of sexual exploitation and abuse is also depicted there, which in some ways is good because it emphasizes what the majority of sexual exploitation and abuse cases in the media and for the UN have been, which is generally focused around children, around adolescents, but also involving adult women as well. So I think there's lots of, if you think about this as a product that the UN is sort of launching to kind of really tackle this problem head on, which has been really in the news for the last 3 years quite consistently as something that really we need a sea change around. This document is kind of I'd say quite a disappointment. Again, the emphasis is around, the response from the UN has been around training, but none of the training, so I think the training that has existed so far for peacekeepers to try and reduce incidents of sexual violence and sexual exploitation, most of that is about sort of teaching peacekeepers what sexual exploitation and abuse is, so giving very, very broad definitions, but they're also quite clear. So in some ways, it's a really positive aspect of the training. But again, emphasizing the punitive approach rather than a kind of preventative approach. And in that training, there's very little attention to lots of very important issues, such as wider inequalities, issues to do with what is patriarchy, what is colonialism, what do we think about colonialism if you're going, what is safeguarding? You know, what does it mean to actually be responsible for the protection of children? This is not part of this training. It may be part of other forms of training, but certainly there's none of these kind of key either conceptual analytical concepts or terms from the policy and practitioner world more generally. And then maybe just to sort of conclude on this issue about what kinds of things are being taught. I mean, one of the fascinating things about the guidelines in training and the written guidelines in the aid memoir are about the issue of consent. So peacekeepers are taught that consent doesn't matter. Because basically the context in which people are engaged is one of inequality. It's one of severe disadvantage for the local population. But I think that that's quite problematic because what it does, in a sense, is it teaches peacekeepers that consent doesn't matter, and so there's no, in a sense, no training around what, if there is such a category that could be relayed to people, what healthy sexualities are, what frank discussions about prostitution, about sex work, about sexual health, about child abuse, about things like intimate partner violence, contraception, all these kinds of key issues around reproductive, sexual health, and sexual attitudes. There's not really a space for that discussion because it's generally framed in a very punitive way. So I think, just to bring up some of those issues for discussion and for us to consider, because I think in terms of sexual exploitation and abuse, I mean, maybe Connor might disagree with me in the discussion, but I think it's reached a point where none of the measures that have been put in place over the last 30 years have had any significant success in tackling the problem. So I think another type of discussion is actually in order.
Thank you very much, Marcia. Thank you very much, Marcia. Now I'm going to give the floor to Tamia Rebelo, and she holds a PhD in International Relations from the University of São Paulo, USP. She was a fellow at the CART Center for Human Rights Policy, a Harvard Kennedy School Study Center, where she conducted her sandwich doctorate research with Fulbright CAPS scholarship. She has a master's degree from the postgraduate program in International Relations, Santiago Dantas. She holds a degree in International Relations from the Pontifical Catholic University of Rio de Janeiro, having studied at the University of California, Los Angeles. She is currently a lecturer in the International Relations course at the Centro Universitário Belas Artes in São Paulo and the Senac University Center in Santo Amaro. Thank you very much, Tamia. You have 15 minutes.
Hello everybody. Thank you all for coming here today. Actually, I'm very excited to see so many people here, in spite of everything that we've been going through the past few days. It's an honor and a pleasure to be here. So thank you again. I was once an undergrad student here at the International Relations Department. So I'm very happy to be back actually. It's a very important moment to see old friends and to make new ones. So thank you again. And I would like to start by giving special thanks to Kai and Maia for their invitation. This is such an opportunity to listen to a variety of reflections on gender and UN peacekeeping. So I think this is actually a crucial space given for language that is not traditionally thought as security language. So again, thank you for that, for putting all of this together with all these amazing panelists. So I'm very honored to be here. And today I'm going to talk about, and I think I'm going to bring up a little bit of the conversation that Marcia has already started. Okay, I'm going to do this. Not with this. Okay, so today I'm going to talk about the conceptual challenges of moving the women peace and security agenda forward, paying particular attention to misconceptions that could arise from the ways in which women and gender concepts are organized in the Security Council documents. So Marcia was just saying and sharing with us her thoughts about training materials and how it's very difficult to put that into practice and how we don't discuss very important issues. So basically, if we take a look at that, we kind of ask ourselves, so where does this come from? So national entities and institutional entities usually take Security Council documents as their starting points. So it's good to get back and then look at those documents and ask ourselves, so what does the Security Council is telling us about this? So basically, I want to start by talking a little bit about the Women, Peace and Security agenda. So actually, this agenda is all about making sure that women get to enjoy rights, opportunities, and protective measures that should be enjoyed by everyone. So that's the basic assumption. And this agenda calls attention to women's involvement in the prevention and conflict resolutions, and also in peace-building activities. And it also emphasizes the need for steps to be taken to prevent and to respond to all acts of violence, especially against women and girls. So, let me start by stressing the importance of this discourse. Feminists are striving to enter the halls of power, and there is discourse on gender equality everywhere at this point. So, if we look at the United Nations, we can see lots of documents being produced and being published about women in peacekeeping operations. So we have to acknowledge that the UN has already put an impressive amount of effort into putting policies, guidance, and training materials to support implementation of the Women, Peace and Security agenda. But the thing here is that a lot of important peace and security policy makers just don't get it. They just don't get what difference it would make to have more women involved in all stages of peace processes. And they just don't get what gender equality would make for peace negotiations. So the trouble here is that even if he or she accepts the political importance of this discourse, they tend to view it through a technical lens. So they tend to view it in more practical or more functional terms. So what I want to bring to this conversation today is the fact that those with power to make a difference might not be willing to deal with those issues, so they think it's not worth it, or they might not be employing a gender lens all the way through. So they are actually framing women's rights in security terms in a sense that we get to deal only with those issues in more practical or more functional terms. So the main argument that we use here is that deploying more women is seen as necessary to achieve operational effectiveness. And what does the UN expect from women based on this premise, based on this fundamental assumption? So the UN expects women to interview survivors of gender-based violence. The UN expects women to mentor female at police and military institutions, and the UN expects them to interact with civilians, and usually those victims of sexual violence. So this is important, and I'm not saying that. So talking about those issues are important. We need to bring that type of conversation, but we also have to go deep into that argument and also ask about relations of dominance and subordination between men and women within host nations, but more importantly, within peace operations. So when we look at the UN And when we look at the documents that the Security Council is publishing, we don't see that type of argument, and we don't see any sort of stimulus to go forward with that type of discussion. So actually the trouble here is that framing women's rights and talking about gender dimensions in general might prevent the transformative aspirations of this project. So actually we have to take a look at the Security Council documents and see how women and gender concepts are being organized in those frames, in those parameters, if I can say like this. And my first question here was to then look at those documents and to acknowledge that the UN has increased content related to the Women, Peace and Security agenda. So that's a fact. And if we look at the content and if we look at the text that we see published by the Security Council, we might find that, four main points here. So my content analysis revealed that Women, Peace and Security agenda doesn't dialogue, doesn't talk with other areas in the United Nations. So basically framing issues of gender and women in security terms lead us to, in a sense, marginalize other documents and other contributions that are very important to this debate. So I think the first panel, in a sense, addressed the fact that we are missing some important points from the human rights sphere here. So we are not bringing human rights documents and human rights approaches to debate the Women, Peace and Security agenda. So this is a very important point that I want to make here, and I complement what has been said in the first panel. The second point that I want to raise is that there is a close association between gender and women concepts in Security Council documents, and they are very, very often used as synonymous. The third point here is that there is an emphasis on the protection aspect of this agenda. So there is a high perception that women and girls are targets of all types of violence, and they are in extreme need of protection. And the question is, who's going to protect them? The last point is that there is a growing attention being paid for the participation aspect. So the first and the last resolutions address that point a little bit more than the ones in the middle. And you can see that women are portrayed as agents of change, and women are portrayed as the ones who could produce change in security environments. So these four main points could produce misconceptions about women, especially when they are deployed to peace operations. So if we look at those findings and we think really through them, we can start to realize that people who read those documents might end up translating the Women, Peace and Security agenda in terms of tasks and roles as belonging naturally to women. And that's a critical issue that I want to bring and to discuss with you today. So I'm going to briefly talk about the four misconceptions that could result from the ways in which women and gender concepts are organized in Security Council documents. So the first one is that women naturally contribute to peace efforts. This assumption promotes an essentialist and narrow view of women as always peacemakers, as always mothers, thus reinforcing the idea that it could only be positioned in gender-specific roles. This could prejudice the understanding that women play different roles in different scenarios, and this could also promote unrealistic expectation of appropriate policies carried out without any sort of concern about systems or structures that women might be fighting to transform. So we have to really think through this. The second misconception is that protection issues are equivalent to conflict-related sexual violence. So we all know that there is a special focus on sexual violence if we look at the Security Council documents. And this could justify, for example, that women could only be positioned in sexual-related tasks, that they could only be deployed to interface with other women, usually victims of sexual violence. So there's another problem here, but I will add this to the following panelists to discuss a little bit further. So the third one is women always bring a unified voice to peace processes. So this assumption marginalizes women's many and even divergent voices in these processes. Women's role and experience in conflicts is more integral and more varied than is portrayed in UN documents. And the last point that I want to make here is that gender expertise is a role that comes naturally to women. So it has been largely recognized that gender is a skill set and not something that comes naturally to women. So men and women can fulfill this responsibility and not only women. So just going to my final thoughts, very quick here because I'm running out of time. So misconceptions could easily deepen gender stereotypes. And if we remember what I just said in the beginning of this presentation, the Security Council recommends UN entities and member states to use those documents to inform policies and practices. So national institutions usually take those documents as their main reference to produce materials, to produce training, to produce guidance. So we have to take into consideration that if we don't take a step further, and if we don't look at relations of subordination and discrimination, we won't see the barriers, invisible and visible barriers that women have in order to acquire all experience they need to reach higher positions in all military institutions, but here talking specifically about peacekeeping operations. So the ways in which those concepts are represented and are organized in the UN could produce unintended consequences. So the conceptual architecture is there. We have lots of documents. We have the Security Council increasing documents on topics related to the Women, Peace and Security agenda. And if you only look at the numbers, you will see that mandates are also, the number of references of women, peace and security are also increasing in UN peacekeeping mandates. But how? How those concepts are being organized and how they are informing those who are taking the material as reference. So I will end up here and leave questions for Q&A. Thank you so much for that.
Thank you very much, Tamia. Now we're going to move forward to the Paula's presentation. Just a brief presentation of her academic and professional achievements. Paula Drummond holds a PhD in International Relations, Political Science at the Graduate Institute, Geneva. She is also a researcher at the Global South Unit for Mediation. Paula is also a member of the academic network of Women's International League for Peace and Freedom and is associated with the Gender Center at the Graduate Institute of International Relations. She defended her doctorate in PhD in International Relations, at the Graduate Institute of International Relations and Development Studies in June 2017, endorsed with summa cum laude mention. She holds a degree in International Relations from PUC-Rio and Law of the University of Rio de Janeiro, State University. She acted as a professor and adjunct coordinator of the PUC-Rio International Relations undergraduate course. This line of research focuses on the area of gender, peace, and security. So, Paula, 15 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you so much. It's also a pleasure to be here. As Tamia mentioned, we were a bit apprehensive yesterday with the situation in Rio, and we're all devastated that all the huge amount of work that I, Maria, Claudia put into making this happening all of a sudden would be too restricted to a small audience. So I'm really happy to see that, you know, we could make it, and we also have technology on our side to broadcast the debate. And you know, I invited this invitation very gladly as an opportunity to re-immerse into peace operations debate after a while away from it during the PhD research. And the goal of my presentation here is to basically try to advance and to critically interrogate the role of gender in peace operations, picking back on what Tanya said of this conceptual frames and the conceptual framework that is set upon through the Women, Peace and Security Resolution, and interrogate, I mean, what does this mean in practice? How is gender translated in UN practices? And analytically focusing on one segment of peace operations, which is policies and programs addressing conflict-related sexual violence. And the way I started doing this for this presentation is basically reviewing UN documents that document and then that systematize what is called best practices on addressing sexual violence, and looking at this, you know, these documents that constantly disappoint us, Marcia. So,
Not just me.
exactly. So I have started doing this task by looking at two different documents. So the first one is the UN Women DPKO Analytic Inventory of Peacekeeping Practices Addressing Conflict-Related Sexual Violence, and the DPKO DFS Gender Forward-Looking Strategy. And my presentation here today is divided into two main parts. So the first one starts mapping these practices, and the second and last part will address a little bit the gaps and the silences and invisibilities that stem from these issues. And the relevance of, you know, addressing how the UN is looking at and trying to tackle sexual violence, I think Antonia already addressed it in a way in her presentation, is due to the thematic protagonism that conflict-related sexual violence has been gaining in the Women, Peace and Security agenda. So if you think thematically on how the Women, Peace and Security is organized, you have 4 specific resolutions only addressing conflict-related sexual violence. And this has, of course, generated a sort of uneasy feelings with feminist and women's groups who also have, you know, other priorities and other issues happening in conflict situations and in post-conflict situations that also deserve attention. But the issue is that sexual violence, you know, gained the spotlight in recent years. So the idea is to critically look at, you know, how this has been being done in practice. And when you look at these two documents, what comes out is that these practices of addressing and trying to prevent and responding to conflict-related sexual violence, they can be organized into 3 main types. So the first is what the UN Women document called the preventive protective measures, so conflating these 2 P's out of the 4 paradigms or organizing cores of the Women, Peace and Security agenda. The second one is through community engagement and liaison, and the third one is response. And as you can see from Tanya's analysis of documents, the protection emphasis also translates into practices through the bulk of attention of the operational work of the UN goes into this sort of practices. So basically, when you look at these documents and how they are documented as best practices, you see that pages and pages are actually documenting the same thing and the same logic with different names. So it's basically saying how the UN peacekeeping conducted firewood patrols, water route patrols, market patrols, trade route patrols, border patrols, school patrols, food patrols. Basically, escorting women and children in their everyday routines. So basically trying to accompany and provide immediate restraints to men around that might harass these individuals. So what you see there is a through these patrols, is the militarization of routine civilian activities, with these peacekeepers following them around to try to contain and provide this immediate response. But of course, there's not only this, right? I mean, there's also the quick impact projects, which provide, a huge amount of relevant responses in terms of, trying to figure out what would a gender-sensitive camp design look like, and think in terms of lighting, where should it go, latrines, where should it go, how to make women's lives safer within camps, right? But at the same time, the security-oriented quick impact projects not only do this, they are also trying to, in terms of documented practices, provide firewood, cook and fuel, efficient stoves, and distribution of pre-cooked things, which is good, right? I mean, it makes life easier within the camps in a very insecure situation, whereas at the same time, it's quite a restrictive measures in terms of mobility. So you address sexual violence by, trying to contain these individuals as much as possible within the camp, so they cannot go out, and therefore you will address sexual violence by creating this kind of mobility measures, and at the same time providing very paternalistic and protection-dependent ways in engaging with civilian populations. So you pre-cook their bins, you talk to them, and participation here comes really through talking to women about, alternative sources of food or more efficient ways of cooking food, and etc. So pretty much reproducing this logic. And what I found interesting with this thing of the fuel-efficient stoves, which is a huge thing when you talk about quick impact projects, is that when you look at these documents, I was surprised to see that actually, at least in Darfur, the documented practice there is that the fuel-efficient stove issue didn't start as a gender thing. It actually started as a way to minimize environmental degradation, and then is now being documented as a best practice of conflict-related sexual violence, which means that our best practices in terms of addressing gender doesn't matter to it. So then you have, the Rwanda Defense Forces in Darfur who helped a huge amount of UNAMID's work in providing this knowledge population, saying that, we're trying to minimize environmental degradation, but it's actually well appreciated by the women if you think, and this is how gender is being incorporated into, how gender knowledge is actually being sidelined or incorporated as a byproduct of something else, in a sense. And in terms of, just to go into, I'm not sure how I am in terms of time, but
yeah, you're good.
In terms of a community liaison and response, which are the two remaining categories and more marginalized in this practices, you have, of course, other important elements such as the mobile clinics that provide the psychosocial, medical, and legal assistance to survivors of sexual violence, and women's forums, community alert networks, and measures to build liaison with potential perpetrators of sexual violence. And I think here is the more sensitive issues with community liaison and response, in my opinion. Because when the UN tries to address conflict-related sexual violence in reaching out to potential perpetrators, what you see from these initiatives is that the focus is on local young men and demobilized combatants, which means that peacekeepers are not seen as part of the conflict-related sexual violence continuum, in a sense, and I will talk more about this in my conclusion. But also the involvement of women in this community liaison and responses, at least through these two different documents, and my idea is to expand this if a publication comes through, is actually cooptating local knowledge to provide intelligentsia to peacekeeping operation rather than necessarily a consultation of priorities. So it's a sort of a consultation and participation for intelligence gathering for more protection rather than participation as an end in itself. So protection, still hangs around as the priority of the United Nations. So I have 5 minutes, and I'm coming to the second part of my presentation in terms of gaps and silences. So what you could see from this documented practices is that the first gap and the invisibility that comes out of it is a huge focus on sexual violence as rape. And the thing is, conflict-related sexual violence, I mean, it might seem obvious, but it's not obvious in these documents. It's not only rape. We're talking about sexual slavery, we're talking about enforced impregnation, enforced sterilization, sexual exploitation, castration, sexual mutilations, and a wide range of practices that utilize sexual means and exploit women's bodies, but also men's bodies, into the dynamics of conflicts. And this creates some sort of invisibilities, not only in terms of these patterns of sexual violence that are not being addressed by these policies and programs, but also in terms of who the victims are, or who might be attacked in this practice. And I'm here talking about sexual violence against men, who's becoming a topic of discussion, but also sexual violence against sex and gender minorities. So when you see gender as women, there are other patterns of violence that are also drawing upon gender as a power relation that are being invisibilized, especially for those such as homosexuals, bisexuals, and you just have to look into the Syria conflict and what is happening in Lebanon with immigrants to see that how gender operates as a power relations, power relation also affects how these individuals are being increasingly targeted by sexual violence. And in terms of perpetrators, again, the UN is actually concentrated in narrowing perpetrators' issues to the local level. So the problem is local men. And peacekeepers are only portrayed, at least in this report and in conflict-related sexual violence in general, as the eyes and ears of the community. And I'm saying this, I mean, although the focus is on these documents, it is surprising to see, for example, how the Security Council resolution addressing sexual abuse and exploitation, and this is a topic of one of the LSE Gender, Peace and Security publications of Jasmine Westerndorf, of how sexual abuse and exploitation was taken away from the Women, Peace and Security agenda. So we have the scope of 8 resolutions on women, peace and security, and the Security Council left sexual exploitation and abuse as a matter of code of conduct, as a matter of discipline. And I think that Westerndorf's piece really can shed a light to us on how conflict-related sexual violence and sexual exploitation and abuse are being siloed from each other by the Security Council. And this is a very important matter, as when we talk about conflict-related sexual violence, then we segregate the debate about who the perpetrators are and where the problem is located. And what is impressive in the UN Women document in particular, is the only time that they talk about sexual exploitation and abuse, they are also talking about the side effect, the bad side effects of norms, and how, and this is the quote that I brought, how the SEA increasing norms are actually creating more distancing between peacekeepers and the local population. And it strikes me how UN Women is actually portraying, it's together with the PKO, but CE norms as a challenge, as part of the problem rather than part of the solution. And this is, I'll just jump here into my third gap. This is due to this technical understanding of conflict-related sexual violence in the way that conflict-related sexual violence is just a matter of using the right means. So if we only have more robust power response, like more robust military response, strong commandment and control structures than sexual violence would be in the past. And this generates all sorts of technicalities in the field, including the conflation of protection with prevention, including the cooptation of participation as a means of providing better tools for militaries and civilians interfering in the field, and keeping pushing, as Marcia said, masculinities to the margins of peace operations, and maintaining a lack of understanding of the gender dynamics that are going on in the field. So without asking, okay, why are women going outside the camps for water and fuel anyway? And it's not only, of course, a matter of gender division of labor, it is, but it is also a matter that men are being targeted by sex-selective massacres, that are masculinities happening within the conflict situation that are being completely sidelined and invisibilized by this technical understanding of gender expertise. So I think I'm ending here, and then we can discuss this more in Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Paula. Now I'm going to give the floor to Connor Foley. He has worked on legal reform, human rights and protection issues in over 30 conflict zones for a variety of human rights and humanitarian agencies, including UNCPKO, UNHCR, UNEPTA, and Amnesty International. He's the author of The Protection of Civilians by United Nations Peacekeeping Missions that was published by Cambridge University Press, and The Thin Blue Line, How Humanitarianism Went to War. Other books include Protection Brazilian Against Torture, Another System is Possible, Reforming Brazilian Justice, Human Rights, Human Wrongs, The Alternative Report to the United Nations Human Rights Committee, and Legion to Regard, the IRR and the Modern Irish States. So the floor is yours, Connor. 15 minutes.
Perfect. I seem to have lost part of my presentation on this side. Is there anything I can do to go back? No. Go the other way? Okay, we'll go. Great, thanks. Yesterday, Paul and Chris started off their presentations by apologising for being northern voices in the Global South debate. I might just like to say I'm very proud to be the token pale, stale male on this platform, because, in serious point, gender isn't just a women's issue. Gender is about the relation between men and women, and these are issues that affect us as humans. So I'd like to congratulate the organiser of the event, both for inviting me and also for having a gender-balanced platform. As has been said, I've worked for the UN for about 20 years, and I've done a lot of. I've been a protection officer. I've done research. I've done evaluations. I'm doing an evaluation for the UN Human Rights at the moment, and I've also trained. I devised the scenario-based training on protection of civilians, and one of the things that's kind of a stereotype, but academics sometimes make simple things seem a bit complicated, whereas trainers try to make complicated things seem simple. So I'm going to try to. I'm a lawyer. I'm an international lawyer. My LLM and my PhD were on international law, although I've never practiced as a domestic lawyer. And I teach my students here at PUCI how international law functions and then how that can be applied in various conflict zones. And I don't think it's that complicated, but I do think there's widespread misunderstandings about the relationship between international law and national sovereignty. And to slightly invade the previous panel, there was a little bit of the context that human rights was something out there, or protection was something out there, that you have national sovereignty, and then if these primitive states aren't protecting people, international law intervenes, or international organisations intervene. It's not like that. International law is based on national sovereignty. It's a fundamental principle of national sovereignty that states choose to sign up to or ratify international conventions, including international human rights conventions, and incorporate those conventions into their domestic law and apply them through their domestic law. They don't have to incorporate those conventions, but once they have, they become part of their domestic law. So there's no real tension between international sovereignty and national sovereignty, and there's no real concept that states have their sovereignty only so long as they protect people, and then the international community takes that away. That's not how it works. There are instead international laws which cover a variety of issues. Could it be trade and commerce? Should it be refugee rights? Should it be the laws of armed conflict? Should it be international human rights law? And once a state has incorporated that, it becomes applicable. But I think that's important in this understanding when we talk about protection. And I've expanded slightly, apologies, the scope of my presentation. We're talking about gender and protection of civilians in UN peacekeeping operations, but I've added in the concept of gender and protection. Firstly, because actually there's only 10 peacekeeping operations in the world which have got protection mandates, and a couple of them, UNAMID particularly, I mean, is useless. It's not really doing anything. I'm glad to have that confirmed in yet another example of UNAMID's uselessness. Some are great. MINUSTA and OCHI both helped to stabilise the situation, helped restore countries to democracy, and exited successfully. Some, UNMISS and MONUSCO, are necessary. They are performing protection functions. But when you look at the number of conflicts in the world, and the size and scale of those conflicts, most people do not have any sort of protection. Most people in conflict zones do not have any sort of protection from UN peacekeeping missions, let alone UN peacekeeping soldiers with protection mandates. So the protection that we as humanitarian aid workers use, because humanitarian aid workers do tend to be present, my colleagues tend to be present in these conflicts like Syria, and in fact actually regrettable of course is the number of fatalities of peacekeeping soldiers has been. Civilian aid workers have suffered far higher casualties over the last couple of decades, and of course more importantly people have suffered far higher casualties. So the scale of human rights violations of humanitarian crisis is much bigger than these 10 POC operations. And what you can't see there is that we as human rights workers tend to use protection as part of what we do. We provide assistance, that's material assistance, medicine, blankets, food, etc. And we provide protection. And protection is something that we take that protection from international law, primarily from international humanitarian law and international human rights law and international refugee law. But those three bodies of law, which are bodies of law that states have ratified, treat the conception of protection differently, and particularly they differ in their attitude to gender. Refugee law applies to people who are no longer receiving the most basic forms of protection for their own state, and it also provides the mandate of UNHCR. I was a protection officer for UNHCR in Kosovo. I convened the protection working group in Kosovo in that capacity. And our mandate, UNHCR's physical presence, is based on provisions arising from refugee law. The Geneva Conventions provide protection to certain people during armed conflicts. There's international humanitarian law, which consists of the Geneva Conventions and Hague Law. Hague Law is about what weapons you can and can't use. The Geneva Convention is about the protection of people. Basically, who can be attacked, who and what can be attacked, what's the legitimate targets and principle of distinction, and how it can be attacked, and the principle of proportionality. So the protection of international humanitarian law is about defining people during armed conflicts who need protection. And the protection that they're given is that states, by ratifying conventions, the Hague Conventions, the Geneva Conventions, agree to abide by certain principles. And almost all countries in the world have agreed by these principles. Of course, they violate them, but that doesn't mean the laws don't exist. Just as there's crime in Brazil, we still have laws. We know probably most of us have at one point or another violated the speed limit, but we all think the speed limit should exist. So it's the same kind of thing. It's better to have the protection of international humanitarian law than not to have it, although violations are continuing. And one of our jobs, which we see as an ongoing work in progress, is implementation. So the creation of the International Criminal Court, the principle of universal jurisdiction, my involvement in the Pinochet case. These are examples of increasing the bite of international humanitarian and criminal law. Using starvation as a weapon of war is prohibited in the Geneva Conventions, and that's what leads to the right of humanitarian assistance. And the ICRC was set up as an independent, impartial organisation whose humanitarian mission is to protect the lives and dignity of victims of war and internal violence, and to provide them with assistance. So again, you see this distinction between protection, international refugee law, and international humanitarian law, and assistance. So UNHCR, the ICRC, go into crisis, humanitarian crisis, their neutrality is respected, they get access to affected populations to give assistance, but they also have a connection to protection. And Nicaragua v. United States in 1986, one of the key cases, and anyone who wants to talk about international sovereignty and international human rights law has to read Nicaragua, because it said that the principle of non-intervention, the prohibition of the use of force in Article 2 of the UN Charter, are part of customary international law. But they also said the US was doing two things. It was mining the ports outside Managua, and at the same time was giving arms to the Contras. I remember this case particularly because my dad was working for the Sandinista government at the time, instantly making cook stoves, doing analysis of cook stoves and the environmental effect of them. And what they said is that you can give humanitarian assistance during, but only so long as it's given on Red Cross terms, respecting the principle of neutrality, impartiality, and so on. And these are important points. That IHL and refugee law provide mandates for humanitarian organisations to intervene to give assistance, but on the basis on respecting the principle of neutrality and impartiality. And actually, both IHL and refugee law are pretty silent on the question of gender. Gender is not one of the 5 criteria under which you can claim refugee status. It's pretty much not mentioned in the laws of war, which are there's a machista element in them. So gender is not. Organisations, humanitarian organisations who've been operating in humanitarian crisis zones for years, decades, centuries, using the basis of refugee law, IHL and UN Charter law in the last 50 years, do not have gender hardwired into their thinking. International human rights law is quite different. While refugee law and IHL require states and parties to the conflict to respect persons as having certain status according to their membership of a defined group, combatant, civilian, refugee. International human rights law, and remember the Declaration of Human Rights was only 1948, after the UN Charter was adopted, says that all human rights everywhere have rights that are inalienable to them, that are fundamentally part of them, and that includes gender issues. And these treaties have been elaborated in a variety of conventions, some specific to women, some on issues like torture, some on the protection of children. There's special rapporteurs, there's a variety of monitoring mechanisms. The UN Human Rights, which is increasingly expanding its field presence, is doing that. And gender is part of that mainstream agenda. But it isn't part of the conceptual approach to protection of people during crisis. Increasingly, NGOs and increasingly the UN system is integrating human rights and gender into its approach, but is not doing it particularly well. The issue of protection, this is the general definition that ICRC give, all activities aimed at full respect. It's kind of a little bit wishy-washy. It could basically mean anything. A better one is contained here. Françoise Boucher-Saunier, who was the legal director of MSF, and I think her definition has that relationship between accountability and power, and that humanitarian actors, in talking about protection, and we tend to draw on all these bodies of law. We tend to draw on UN Charter law, we tend to draw on refugee law, we tend to draw on IHL, and increasingly we're drawing on human rights law. But defining what exactly protection is defining accountability. What protection isn't, though, is protection of civilians. I mean, when we as humanitarians use protection, we are not talking about the physical protection of civilians, because simply we don't have the guns. We can't do it. And I'm now going to, I realise that I'm running out of time, and also Paolo has covered some of these issues. There have been this variety of resolutions on women in peacekeeping, and Paolo's quite right that they have segregated and divided the issue of women peacekeeping and the issue of conflict-related sexual violence in a way which I think is unhelpful. So I'm just going to zoom through these. But then I'm going to touch on two things which are problems, current contemporary problems, which centre on accountability. The first one is Article 103 of the UN Charter, a fundamental point that in the event of a conflict between the obligations of the members of the UN under the Charter and their obligations under international agreement, their obligations under the Charter should prevail. This is Kosovo. You can actually see where I used to live in one of those tower blocks. And these are two cases I mentioned yesterday. One concerned the right to life, the other concerned the right to liberty, where we, the UN, I was on the Criminal Justice Task Force, we simply overrode basic human rights standards, the right to liberty and the right to life. The case was taken to the European Court, and the European Court said that because of Article 103, they couldn't question the UN Charter. Chapter 7 gives the UN Security Council such power that it can override all other treaty obligations. And the second one, Article 105, UN immunity, the Haiti cholera case, where the UN simply invoked its immunity, although there's no question that it caused the cholera outbreak that's killed thousands of people in Haiti. There's good reasons for Article 105 and 103, but they cause substantial problems when it comes to accountability. And when it comes to sexual exploitation and abuse, I've got about 2 minutes left to speak. I wrote this assignment advise at Keeping Children Safe, and we did a seminar here in Brazil on this issue and published this report as part of it. So, as I said, I understand the purpose of UN immunity. I am working for the UN at the moment. I currently have UN immunity. It's great. And it's a serious problem, because when people commit criminal offences in a country, if they can be arrested by the local authorities, in many of the countries the peacekeeping soldiers operate, most of the countries peacekeeping soldiers operate, the justice systems, criminal justice systems, do not accord with principles related to a fair trial. And so perpetrators could not expect to get justice if they're put through the criminal justice system of the DRC, for example. So the UN invokes its immunity. It will send soldiers home, and it will send civilians home, and the UN can't prosecute them themselves. So this is a huge problem. And there's also different problems. There's a problem of peacekeepers, which gets most of the attention, but actually the civilian aid workers are a bigger part of the problem. About half the documented cases of sexual abuse carried out by the international community in conflict zones relate to civilian workers. And when you consider that soldiers are far, far, far greater in number, the actual problem is much greater civilian populations. And the problem is essentially, if you can't prosecute them in country, where can you prosecute them? The TCCs can prosecute their soldiers, they can court-martial their soldiers. And generally speaking, that's not such a problem legally, because most military penal codes do allow for extraterritorial prosecutions. There can be some cases where you don't have equivalent offences. The offence of sexual harassment, for example, or sexual exploitation might not be incorporated into a particular country's criminal penal code. But for civilians, it's a much bigger problem, because you don't have extraterritorial jurisdiction to offences such as rape, sexual assault, sexual harassment. I mean, the UK doesn't have this. So we have a problem. We have a serious legal problem. What do we do about sexual offenders who go to UN missions, commit sexual offences, and then return with impunity? It's a problem partly because of who the TCCs are, the quality of the local justice systems of the TCCs, but it's also a problem legally about this sort of legal black hole. How do we deal with it? And there are these practical problems as well, which how you get justice for the victims when you're relying on extraterritorial prosecutions. So I'm run out of time, so I'll leave it there.
Okay, thank you very much.